On October 2, 1939, a nation of 35 million people simply ceased to exist, not erased from the map by some natural catastrophe, but systematically dismantled by the most horrifying military machine the world had ever known. And what makes this story even more chilling is that Poland's death came not from a single devastating blow, but from 1,000 cuts, each one carefully orchestrated by an enemy that had been planning this destruction for years. And on this particular autumn day, when the last Polish soldiers finally laid down their weapons and the German swastika flew over Warsaw's ruins, it marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of something far darker, a template for conquest and extinction that would reshape the entire continent and bring untold suffering to millions. This is the story of how one nation fought with everything it had, against impossible odds, how ordinary people became heroes in their final hours, and how the fall of Poland would echo through the decades to come. A cautionary tale about the price of appeasement, the speed of modern warfare, and the fragility of civilizations that believe they are too important to be destroyed. When Adolf Hitler gazed at Poland from his office in Berlin in the spring of 1939, he saw not a neighboring nation worthy of respect, but living space, what he called Lebensraum, territory that belonged by right to the German people, and more importantly, he saw a barrier that had to be removed before he could execute his grandest ambitions to the east. The Polish state sat like an awkward obstruction between Germany and the Soviet Union. And while Hitler privately harbored even darker designs against Russia, Poland had to be dealt with first, swept aside like dust before the German war machine could move on to greater conquests. The question was never whether Germany would attack Poland, but when and how the world would respond. In the months leading up to the invasion, Hitler engaged in a peculiar dance of diplomacy, demanding territorial concessions through diplomatic channels, particularly the return of the free city of Danzig and access to the Polish corridor, that strip of land that gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea but separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. To Hitler, these demands seemed modest, reasonable even, but they were never really about the territory itself. They were a test, a measure of how far he could push the Western powers before they would actually stand in his way. The British and French watched this diplomatic theater with growing anxiety, and after years of allowing Hitler to remilitarize the Rhineland, annex Austria, and seize Czechoslovakia without firing a shot, they finally began to understand that appeasement would never satisfy the German dictator's appetite for conquest. In late August 1939, just days before the invasion, Hitler shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact with his ideological enemy, the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which included a secret protocol dividing Poland and Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. This agreement removed Hitler's greatest fear, a war on two fronts. With the Soviet Union neutralized, he could attack Poland with the confidence that his eastern border would remain secure, and the Polish government suddenly found itself abandoned by its potential ally in Moscow, forced to stand alone against the Nazi onslaught. The Polish military had spent months preparing for this moment, though no amount of preparation could have truly readied them for what was coming. The Polish army consisted of about 1.5 million men, organized into an outdated military structure that relied heavily on cavalry, a romantic notion of warfare that would prove catastrophically inadequate against modern armored warfare. While Polish soldiers were brave and resourceful, they were equipped with older rifles and artillery pieces. They had virtually no tanks to speak of, perhaps 200 obsolete vehicles against the German panzer divisions, and their air force, though its pilots were skilled and courageous, was massively outnumbered and outclassed. The Poles knew the odds were terrible, but they also knew that surrender meant extinction, that the Nazi racial ideology left no room for a Polish state or a Polish nation. They understood, in ways that some of their Western counterparts seem not to. Exactly what Hitler represented and what his victory would mean. On September 1st, 1939, at dawn, Germany unleashed Blitzkrieg lightning war against Poland, and the world witnessed for the first time the full fury of a new kind of warfare that would define the entire conflict. German planes screamed out of the sky, hitting Polish airfields, railroads, and cities with devastating precision, and the Polish Air Force, caught largely on the ground, was virtually eliminated in the first days of the campaign. German tanks and motorized infantry poured across the border in coordinated assaults that shattered Polish defensive lines before they could be properly organized. And while the Polish army fought with determination and courage, inflicting real casualties on the Germans and achieving tactical successes in several engagements, they were simply overwhelmed by the speed, coordination, and sheer firepower of the German assault. The Polish military had expected to hold out for weeks, hoping that the British and French would mobilize and attack Germany from the west, relieving the pressure on Poland. But this relief never came. The Western powers declared war on Germany 2 days after the invasion, but they made no real effort to attack, content to sit behind their fortifications and hope that somehow the situation would resolve itself, a passivity that sealed Poland's fate. As the German army advanced relentlessly eastward, the Polish government faced an agonizing decision, whether to fight to the bitter end in Warsaw or withdraw to continue the struggle from the south and east. The decision was made to fall back toward the Bug River and eventually attempt to regroup in the southeast, where they hoped to establish a defensive line and perhaps hold out long enough for Western intervention to materialize. This hope was misplaced. On September 17th, having secured his agreement with Stalin, Hitler's primary military concern disappeared when Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border, attacking from the rear. The Polish army, already battered from days of fighting the Germans, suddenly found itself caught in a catastrophic trap, attacked from both sides by enemies it could not possibly defeat. The Polish leadership realized within hours that the war was lost, that continuing to fight would only result in the destruction of what remained of their army and the certain death of hundreds of thousands of civilians. Some Polish units continued to fight bravely, launching desperate counterattacks against the German advance, but the outcome was never in doubt. Refugees flooded the roads, clogging the routes to the southeast, as civilians desperately tried to flee the advancing armies. And the German Air Force, showing a callousness towards civilian life that would become increasingly characteristic of Nazi Germany, strafed these refugee columns, killing thousands of men, women, and children with machine gun fire from the sky. Warsaw itself became a symbol of Polish resistance and defiance. The capital, surrounded by German forces, became an island of Polish sovereignty in a sea of Nazi conquest. The city's commander, General Władysław Sikorski, and the civilian leadership debated the merits of continuing a hopeless defense versus surrendering to spare the civilian population from destruction. What followed was a siege of the city that lasted nearly 3 weeks, with Polish defenders conducting a street-by-street, building-by-building resistance against overwhelming German firepower. The Germans poured artillery and aerial bombardment into Warsaw with increasing intensity, leveling buildings, destroying infrastructure, and killing thousands of civilians who had nowhere to flee. The city became a nightmare landscape of burning buildings, rubble-filled streets, and corpses. Yet still the Polish defenders held on, not because they believed they could win, but because they wanted to show the world and themselves that they would not surrender without a fight, that Polish honor could not be purchased with mere survival. Inside Warsaw's rubble, Polish soldiers and civilians endured an apocalyptic situation. Food became scarce, water supplies were cut off, and the constant bombardment never ceased. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded and dying, and disease began to spread through the crowded shelters where people huddled for protection from the shells and bombs. The commanding officers knew that their position was untenable, that every hour they continued to resist meant more death and destruction. Yet they also knew that surrender carried a price heavier than death for a nation facing obliteration. The decision to surrender Warsaw was made not easily, but with the grim understanding that continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except the senseless death of more soldiers and civilians. On October 2nd, 1939, that fateful date which marks Poland's official capitulation, the city's last defenders laid down their weapons and marched into German captivity. The total cost of Poland's 17-day military campaign was staggering. Some 200,000 Poles killed, wounded, or missing, more than 500,000 captured as prisoners of war, and civilian casualties that would eventually number in the hundreds of thousands. The German army had suffered around 45,000 casualties in the campaign, a shocking number that demonstrated Poland's fierce resistance, but a price far more easily afforded by Hitler's war machine than by Poland's small nation. The fall of Warsaw was not merely a military defeat. It was the symbolic destruction of a nation. As German troops paraded through the city's destroyed streets, as the swastika was raised over the ruins, Poland ceased to exist as an independent state. What followed was infinitely darker than mere military occupation. The Nazi regime, true to its ideology, began implementing a systematic policy of subjugation and annihilation designed specifically for Poland. Unlike Western European nations, which were occupied but not destroyed, Poland was slated for a far grimmer fate. The Polish state was to be dismantled, its territory divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, according to the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Polish people themselves, according to Nazi racial ideology, were Untermenschen, subhumans, whose very existence threatened German racial purity. The west-central regions of Poland were annexed directly into the German Reich and subjected to immediate Germanization policies. Poles were expelled from their homes, their property seized, and German settlers brought in to replace them. The eastern regions fell under Soviet control, where different horrors awaited, as Stalin's regime conducted its own reign of terror against Polish intellectuals, military officers, and community leaders. The remaining central region, called the General Government, was established as a brutal colonial state under German control, ruled by Hans Frank as a virtual dictatorship designed solely to serve German war purposes through plunder and exploitation. What makes the fall of Poland so significant in the broader context of World War II and human history is that it revealed, to anyone willing to see, exactly what Nazi Germany intended for the territories it conquered. Poland's fall was the opening act in a drama that would include the Holocaust, the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, and the attempted extermination of entire peoples deemed racially inferior by the Nazi regime. The Germans established concentration camps across Poland, beginning the process of mass imprisonment and murder that would eventually consume the lives of millions. The Warsaw Ghetto, established later in 1940, would become one of the largest and most horrific concentration camps in occupied Europe, where over 400,000 Jews were imprisoned in a tiny area of the city, subjected to starvation, disease, and eventually deportation to the extermination camps. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Auschwitz. The machinery of genocide was assembled in Poland, in the conquered territories where Hitler believed he could operate with relative impunity, and where millions would be murdered in the name of Nazi racial ideology. Yet the fall of Poland on October 2, 1939, was not the end of Polish resistance, or the end of Poland itself. Even as the last soldiers surrendered in Warsaw, Polish commanders were already planning how to continue the struggle. The Polish government, evacuated from the country, established itself first in Romania and then in France, and after France's fall in 1940, in London. Polish military units regrouped and continued fighting alongside the British, and eventually the Americans and Soviets. Polish pilots flew in the Battle of Britain. Polish soldiers fought in North Africa. Poland contributed to the invasion of Normandy, and Polish units fought on every major front of the war. Inside occupied Poland, a vast underground resistance movement developed, conducting sabotage, gathering intelligence, and keeping alive the flame of Polish independence and national identity, even as the Nazis attempted to erase Poland from history. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 would demonstrate that even after 5 years of brutal occupation and genocide, the Polish people retained the will and capacity to fight back. And though that uprising was ultimately crushed by the Germans and Soviets, it remained a testament to Polish courage and determination. The fall of Poland also served as a wake-up call to the Western democracies, though sadly it came too late to prevent the catastrophe. British and French leaders, who had clung to hopes of negotiation and appeasement, finally understood that Hitler could not be satisfied through diplomatic means, that his ambitions were unlimited, and his ideology fundamentally incompatible with any peaceful coexistence. The British, particularly, under the newly appointed Prime Minister Winston Churchill, declared that they would fight Germany to the end, that they would never surrender, never accept German domination of Europe. Britain's refusal to make peace after France fell, despite the German offer to negotiate, ensured that the war would continue, that Hitler's ambitions would ultimately be thwarted, but it came at a terrible price for all involved. Poland's suffering during the war was second only to that of the Soviet Union. Estimates suggest that around 6 million Polish people died during the conflict, roughly 17% of the entire population, a staggering loss that made Poland one of the war's greatest victims. Polish Jews, who had composed the largest Jewish community in Europe, were almost entirely annihilated, with over 90% of Poland's 3 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Polish intellectuals, clergy, teachers, and community leaders were systematically killed in a deliberate campaign of cultural genocide designed to eliminate any chance of Poland's future independence. The country's infrastructure was devastated, its economy destroyed, its cultural heritage partially obliterated. When the war finally ended in 1945, Poland was liberated. But not truly free, the Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the fighting against Germany in Eastern Europe, claimed Poland as part of its sphere of influence. And Poland would spend the next 45 years under Soviet domination, a different kind of occupation, but an occupation nonetheless. Understanding the fall of Poland requires understanding the full context of Nazi ideology, the mechanisms of totalitarian warfare, and the price of allowing aggressive regimes to act without meaningful opposition. It is a story of courage and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, of ordinary people making extraordinary choices when confronted with historical evil, and of the terrible consequences that follow when the world's democracies fail to stand together against tyranny. The lessons of Poland's fall are as relevant today as they were in 1939, that small nations cannot protect themselves without international support, that ideologies based on racial supremacy and territorial conquest are fundamentally incompatible with peace, that appeasement of aggressive powers only encourages further aggression, and that the cost of not standing up to evil early is infinitely higher than the cost of standing up to it immediately. Poland fell on October 2nd, 1939, not because the Polish people lacked courage, not because Polish soldiers fought poorly, but because they faced an enemy with vast material advantages, superior strategy and tactics, and an ideology so alien to human decency that it would take the combined might of nearly the entire world to defeat it. Yet even in Poland's fall, there was a kind of triumph, the triumph of a people who chose to fight rather than submit, who maintained their sense of identity and dignity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. and who ultimately survived, not their war or their occupation, but their determination to see their nation live again beyond the darkness of Hitler's shadow.